I made a poll a few weeks ago about what videos the audience wanted, and I'm going to make the two most popular results as videos. The most popular result was this video, or what the parallels between our society and the Weimar Republic are. The second one was a video on how propaganda works, but I want to read a few books on that topic before I make it. The Weimar Republic was a period of German history between 1919 and 1933, or after the loss in World War I, and before the rise of the Nazis to power. It's a strange period of history, nothing like the time period before or after, in which Germany was run by one form of conservative militarism followed by another variety, and the time period in between was some bizarre psychedelic trip that barely makes sense. On the other hand, though, it totally makes sense. Weimar seems out of place for the era of history it was occurring in, given the Western world in the early 20th century has a reputation for being prude, upright, and sterile. Meanwhile, the Weimar period is this bizarre libertine sexual world. It's something which seems much more out of our era of history. Let's look into why this happened. In a lot of ways, Weimar seems like a prologue to the degeneracies of our era, a sort of warning that wasn't heeded. I frankly hadn't thought that much about the Weimar before this poll wanted me to make a video about it, but now that I've done the research, I see that there are lots of fascinating threads to pull on. This is a time period in which a lot was happening, and which surprisingly influenced our world more than I think a lot of folks would realize. Let's get into the Weimar Republic. During the Weimar period, Germany faced feminization and German men were emasculated. This feeling can be found in our world today. Testosterone levels have been declining for decades. Sperm count and strength in men are also decreasing exponentially, with a 1/3 decrease in mean sperm count over the last 50 years. Researchers call these changes alarming from an evolutionary point of view. But there's hope. Black Forest Turkesterone with Tongkat Ali limited edition supplement has been dubbed the feminization killer since it combines two of the most potent natural testosterone boosters. Turkesterone is a natural anabolic compound that supports muscle growth, improves endurance, and boosts testosterone levels. Tongkat Ali is an ancient natural herb that's been used for thousands of years to increase testosterone levels, improve libido, and reduce stress levels. Black Forest has said that since this product is limited edition, once it goes out of stock, it will be out of stock forever. So make sure to purchase yours ASAP. I actually do use the Tongkat Ali, and I can personally vouch for its effectiveness. I've noticed a significant difference in my energy levels, strength, sleep, and overall well-being. I can really feel the difference when I take this. And the best part is you can try the Black Forest Turkesterone with Tongkat Ali with an amazing buy two, get one free offer already applied on the website. So check out Black Forest and reclaim your masculinity now. Part 1. Weimar Germany. There are certain eras of history that shouldn't happen. However, due to weird combinations of events that no one expected, they end up occurring. The Weimar is one of them. Due to bizarre, which is a word I keep using to describe this time period for a reason, factors, a social group which would never otherwise take over society became dominant in German culture for over a decade. To start the story, Germany is a large pluralistic country. I think it's easy for Americans to forget how diverse European countries can be, in that a nation like Germany 100 years ago was filled with loads of different regional cultures, dialects, political and interest groups, all jostling together. Germany was also the largest economy in Europe and the most advanced society in the world artistically, culturally, philosophically, or scientifically. This means that the Germany of this era had immense internal contrasts, much like America today. Carroll Quiggley, in his book Tragedy and Hope, has said that the Germany of this era was run by 5 different social groups. That being the monarchy, the Junker warrior nobility in Prussia who led the military, the industrialists concentrated in the Rhineland, the imperial bureaucracy, and the trade unionists. Except for the trade unionists, all of these were incredibly conservative. This is one of the biggest divides in Weimar and today, in that the conservatives were the deep state and the establishment, while today the left dominates those. What had occurred with the end of World War I was the creation of an artificial Germany which very few people wanted. For example, before Germany signed the humiliating Versailles Treaty, the Germans had conquered almost all of Central Europe, out to the Baltics and Ukraine, turning them into colonies. Germany was technically a monarchy, but had really devolved into being a centrally planned socialist military dictatorship. The remaining Allied countries at the Treaty of Versailles, or really Britain and France since America was out to lunch at the time, crafted this incredibly humiliating treaty which removed Germany's colonial empire, saddled them with an obscene amount of debt, cut down their military to an absolutely pathetic size, among half a dozen other things. The thing the Germans felt most resentful of was that the Allies had forced the Germans to sign that they were guilty for starting the war. Since the Germans had always felt like World War I was forced on them to protect themselves as they were surrounded on all sides, this was especially stinging to their sense of honor. The problem with the Versailles Treaty was that it was harsh enough to be humiliating and build up resentment, but it wasn't hard enough to incapacitate Germany. Germany wasn't divided up as a country or militarily occupied. On the other hand, it wasn't like the end of the Napoleonic Wars either, in which the Congress of Vienna was very careful to not hurt France's pride, thus making it resentful and causing more wars. I mean, an issue here is that Germany is so big and its people so vigorous, brave, and intelligent that the British and the French had no real way to enforce humiliation upon them for a long period. However, in a prime example of cringe Westoid social engineering, the Allies replaced Germany's monarchy with this vague liberal democracy. This is comparable to America trying to establish democracy in Iraq or Afghanistan. The issue is that most Germans didn't really want Germany to be a democracy. There were a pretty small group of classical liberals who were concentrated in the Rhineland, while most Germans were either old stock conservatives who ran Germany's deep state or Marxists who wanted the revolution. That being said, you had this awkward situation in which the German monarchist and nationalist establishment was forced to maintain a government which they hated due to foreign intervention. Right after World War I, Germany had a series of small internal civil wars between rightists and leftists since no one respected the new government. There were the Spartacist communist revolts in Berlin, who were crushed by the reactionary Freikorps. A lot of you probably know how Hitler launched a coup in 1923 with an attempt to take over the government, while using World War I General Ludendorff as a prop. The really insane thing is that Hitler only got a little bit more than a year in jail due to the German deep state being so insanely conservative biased. On top of this, the judges who gave Hitler sentence empathized with Hitler since they hated the regime too, and they wanted a nationalist like Hitler to win. It's similar to how the Antifa types get really light sentences today from the leftist deep state. I think a lot of the American left projects the social structure of Weimar Germany onto our modern society, since our current ruling class has Nazi derangement syndrome. Thus, they obsessed over the historic conditions which existed in the Weimar period, which ended up creating the Nazis, even though they bear basically no relation to life today. This is a theme that we're going to see repeated again and again in this video. As a general rule, everything the left complains about in modern America was true of Weimar Germany. It actually was a racist, hierarchical, nationalistic, patriarchal society with a conservative deep state biased against the left. The Weimar government was dominated by these moderate left-wing types who were ineffective at governing the nation. They also couldn't accomplish much due to either being blackballed by the more radical left, who were Marxist revolutionaries, or the conservative establishment. A disproportionate amount of them were Jewish, which was part of the origin of Hitler's anti-Semitism. The Weimar period has this strange waiting room kind of feel to it. Like everyone involved knew that it wasn't what Germany was supposed to be, but no one had a better idea. An interesting fact is that Weimar Germany was the most legally free country in the world in that time period. It had total suffrage across social classes and even among women. It was a democracy with freedom of speech, religion, and other things. The reality, though, was that the ruling class were authoritarians who viewed this all with contempt. Possibly the biggest issue Weimar Germany ran into was financial problems. The reparations the Allies demanded from them were insane. The logical conclusion to all of this was to insanely artificially print money and create inflation so as to lower the value of the currency so as to pay off the debt with a depreciated, cheaper currency. This is not a bad choice, but it does come with some very dark consequences. Part of me feels bad for saying Weimar was poorly governed, since it was definitely better governed than most countries in the world today, and the leadership was dealt such a really bad hand by circumstance. decadence. The Germans were by nature a very serious and responsible people, the kind who kept large personal savings. The inflation completely wiped out those savings. The German middle class, one of the largest and most prosperous in the world, was effectively wiped out overnight. You can hear about something like this happening in abstract, but it's hard to convey what it was actually like to live through this time. People were legitimately starving in Germany. A great story which shows it is that there was a family which was stockpiling potatoes to survive, but they had to rent out an extra room for cash. The way they dealt with this was by filling the entire room with potatoes, except a path from the bed the person would sleep on to the door. Prostitution became ubiquitous as there were lots of women with nothing to offer except their bodies. The inflation under Weimar was absolutely insane and exists with very few parallels in history. You'll hear crazy anecdotes like that families would use money as wallpaper, given the money was so worthless that it was cheaper than the paper itself. Alternately, that someone would order a beer at a restaurant for 5,000 marks, and then the next beer they ordered that night was 7,000. People had to resort to barter and very primitive economic measures. Germans were completely desperate for money, and it was said that you could sleep with an entire family in exchange for $1 American dollar. Ironically, the economy wasn't that bad for the whole Weimar period. They were able to restabilize the currency so that the middle of the 20s decade was an economic golden age. Not all of the Weimar period was completely miserable to live in, although Germany still wasn't as prosperous as it was before World War I. Germany started with a new currency, and the exchange rate from the old to the new was literally a trillion of the old currency translated to 1 mark in the new currency. That being said, this era of wealth was built off loans from the Americans. Thus, when the American stock market failed in 1929, causing the Great Depression, Germany was one of the countries which was hit the hardest. The brief period that was okay in the Weimar was biased towards city inhabitants, who were, not coincidentally, the kinds of people who were most likely to support the moderate leftists in charge. The rural areas and small business owners were really hit hard by the economic, tax, and regulatory system. These two demographics rebelled by supporting Hitler, who used the new Great Depression to rise to power in 1933. We'll get into why Hitler was so popular and what he symbolized later in this video, but beforehand, let's look at what about the socioeconomic conditions created by the famed social degeneracy of the Weimar period were like. Part 2. Decadence. The kinds of people who dominated in the Weimar period were those who were impractical. The artists, degenerates, socialites, and libertines. This was since this was a time period where, due to large macro-social, political, and demographic forces, nothing could be accomplished anyway, which removed any levers through which the normies could hold the weirdos accountable to social standards. One of the ideas which I have in my head is that humans are a lot closer to insanity than they realize. Normally, a few bad historic events, and that happens. All of this happened to Germany. The thing is that once the economy doesn't work, your country is not allowed to have military aggression, and no one respects the ruling regime, is that you have no leverage you can hold against the weirdos. One of the biggest differences between our era and Weimar is that Weimar was an incredibly young society, while the modern West is aging. What happens when you have lots of bored young people with nothing to do is that they start fucking and partying. Another factor to keep in mind is that due to World War I, the gender imbalance between men and women was off because so many young men had died. This would thus create a leverage in which women had to put out more sexually to compete for men, which is effectively the opposite of our current dynamic in which women have sexual leverage over men. Keep in mind, alcohol and human bodies are very cheap, and thus, if there's nothing else to do, why not be a degenerate? The horrors of World War I, combined with the mass social instability caused by inflation, I think made people live like there was no tomorrow. Keep in mind, inflation erases any savings, thus there's an incentive to spend everything now. To be honest as well, if I had spent years in filthy trenches getting shelled and my friends dying in front of me, I would want to party like there was no tomorrow as well. I think there was a lot of PTSD in this time period that people were drinking away. The 1920s were possibly the decade of the 20th century which saw the most social change, and especially so, the one with the most long-lasting effects. For example, our comprehension of a bunch of different cultural things stems from the 1920s. As a macro-political example, the 20s was a decade in which pacifism, feminism, women voting, a majority urban society, cars, advertising, consumerism, vegetarianism, dressing skimpily, Hollywood, clubbing, science fiction, popular music like jazz, professional sports, and so so much else either stems from or became popular in. Paul Johnson wrote a book called Modern Times, and his start of modern times was in the 1920s, which I agree with. Statistically, the decade in which the amount of clothing women wore declines the fastest was the 1920s. The empowered girl boss archetype is a creation of the 20s. A lot of the flappers would not be out of place among hipsters in Brooklyn today. One of the things people forget is that fashion trends go back significantly further than people think. A great example of this is that this guy from the 50s who looks like a 2010s hipster. People were wearing sunglasses, bikinis, t-shirts, sneakers, and anything else you could imagine decades earlier than most people would think. The art and architecture which dominates our era of history comes from the Weimar period. There's a great book called The Geography of Nowhere, which is about why so much of America looks like this, or giant concrete steel blocks with no culture, meaning, or design. Ironically, this school of architecture comes out of Weimar Germany. This was a derivation of the Bauhaus school, which was created by communists who wanted architecture to not represent the oppressive past, thus opening us up to a future of utopian social engineering. The great irony is that this architectural style saw its total victory in that this style is by far the most popular around the world today, not even in just America, since its brutalist, blocky architecture was cheaper to produce and didn't require making an artistic stand. Thus, corporate capitalist America took what were creations by these artistic German communists who were trying to be avant-garde and then turned it into these soulless, dead concrete blocks. A lot of modern art is from the Weimar period as well. Dada, or this nihilistic style of art which is meant to convey nothing, came out of Germans in this time period. German art of this era was a big proponent in pushing the disturbing, nihilistic, ugly, surreal, and disturbing trends that we see even in art today. You could make the argument that art today has not escaped the mold which was set by this time period on any level. If you watch music videos or modern art, or things that art shows even show, it's all very similar to the artistic mold set by Weimar. It still shocks me how crazy and dysfunctional Germany was in this time period, and yet how creative it was. Yet the far more wealthy and functional Germany of the second half of the 20th century was far less inventive. That being said, Germany in this time was still doing massive technological and intellectual advances. Germany in the 20s was still the country in the world producing the most Nobel Prize winners in science. Albert Einstein came out of this time period, and if you want to expand this to Austria or Switzerland, this was also the era with Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, and Oswald Spengler, or thinkers who are still influential even today. The sheer scope of the deviancy in the Weimar period is shocking. Like, you hear stories about teams of family members who worked as pairs in Brussels. You'll hear stories about bestiality and other absolutely disgusting stuff. The first gender people we hear about are from the Weimar period. There were in which women would dress as men and men as women, and they would pair up with the other. The idea of breaking out of the gender binary, as Camille Paglia has said, is one which pops up in very urbane societies, in which flaunting the natural order is seen as cultured. Being androgynous, just like today, was seen as a positive in the Weimar period. Homosexuality was the most accepted in the Weimar period of almost any other period before the 1960s, which I can think of in history. Bisexuality was very common, and homosexuals were important cultural leaders in the Weimar period, thus eliciting, although not justifying, their later persecution by the Nazis. This was an era of a lot of research into sexuality, in which loads of the theories which underlie the stuff that the modern left believes today, such as a gender spectrum and 10% of the population being gay, were tested, although that stuff later turned out to be pseudoscience. Cabarets, or what were basically strip clubs, became incredibly popular and normalized across Germany. Something I just thought of is that the Weimar period was the first time in German history in which a majority of the female population lived in cities, and much like today, women were more urban concentrated in the Weimar period than men were, and so leaving behind stifling villages where everyone around you and your parents knew who you were sleeping around with gave women of the Weimar period a sexual freedom they hadn't had before. In a way, this video is funny to research in that it leads back so easily to John Haidt's moral foundations theory, or that politics is an extension of irrational biological states or genetic self-interests which we rationalize in retrospect to being rational political opinions. Here's a text wall to explain how progressives and conservatives have differing moral intuitions. That being said, it's funny that I'll see conservative and progressive historical narratives about this time period in which they will be reporting upon the exact same historical fact, but will have wildly different interpretations of what it means due to how they process the world differently. What this shows indirectly is the Weimar period is still part of roughly the same historic era today as was what was going on a century ago, or that the ramifications of the Weimar period are still comprehensible to life today in the way that, say, the 100 Years' War isn't. I mean, the two sides which were fighting in the Weimar era, the right and the left, are the same factions as today, although they've changed a little bit. A big reason for this is that even on a sexual front is that we haven't resolved the philosophic or political issues that were boiling under Weimar, while at the same time the modern left is a creation of Weimar. The modern left, and frankly the paradigm of the entire West today, is fundamentally postmodern in that our society is ruled by the principles that reality is inherently subjective, that we will never know the truth, and that he who is in power controls what the truth is. If you ask top universities or governments what they believe, they're going to openly say these things. That being said, these ideas came out of the Frankfurt School, which again is in Weimar, Germany. The Frankfurt School, who were, as the name suggests, based out of Frankfurt in Germany, were Marxist philosophers who constructed the philosophically subjective framework under which Marxism operates, which boils down to that we control reality, that the oppressor-oppressed dynamic is the most important to the universe, that those in power create truth, and that all social relationships in all different human interaction are based upon power. Again, this is the dominant worldview of our society today, but was created by a pretty small sliver of society in a very strange context, that being German Jewish Marxist academics during the Weimar period. What happened with the rise of Hitler is that these German Jewish Marxists had to flee Germany for very obvious reasons. They came to America and became top professors at Ivy League universities. Them and their buddies gradually took over the Ivy Leagues, converting the professors in the university system to their ideology. As the assortative method for the ruling class in the period since World War II has been the universities, this has allowed the indoctrination of the future ruling class with Frankfurt School ideas, thus resulting in them taking over society. This sounds like a conspiracy theory, but all of this stuff literally happened, and we have very good records for it. This leads to an important point in that we're not actually that similar to the Weimar period in historic conditions, but since our ruling culture was formed during the Weimar period, we end up with a significant amount of cultural similarities. We're not a starving country with a failed currency, at least not yet, who just lost a world war, with a huge young population which is constantly partying while living through a cultural golden age. The opposite, actually, in most of those ways. I have a hot take here that we are a very degenerate society in one way, which is obvious, but at the same time, in a different way, we're weirdly not that degenerate. For an example of this, I find it very strange prostitution is not vastly more popular today. The reason I say that is that on paper, we're perfect for mass prostitution. We're a society which is supposedly sex positive, which supposedly supports prostitution, yet at the same time has a large group of desperately poor young women and sexually frustrated young men. That being said, prostitution is still really rare in modern America. If a celebrity visits a prostitute, it's major gossip and probably will kill his career, and thus is not seen as normal. An irony here is that our relationship with sex is one of the strangest ones in history, where in the Middle Ages, for example, it was on paper a much more sexually repressed society, but the Catholic Church unironically sponsored brothels. In the time of Victorian England, which again was a Puritan society, there was an incredible, obscene amount of prostitution and pornography. At the time, it was just assumed that all the generals in Napoleonic France had used prostitution. And if a major figure today is caught using one, that's, again, probably the end of his career. Young people now party the least of any period in over a century. Young people have the least sex of any period in over a century on top of that. I used to hang out in Los Angeles influence influencer circles, where there are lots of parties which you would expect to reach Weimar levels of degeneracy. That being said, people are too anxious to cut loose, and a lot of partying is about social clout and networking. It's about social signaling, not fun. I think an important difference is that we as a society are vastly more economically stable than the Weimar period, although most young Westerners are poor, but also we are far less psychologically stable. This is why we're still holding onto the cultural forms from Weimar, since we're not creative enough to actually find anything new. Young people today are too anxious to do the crazy stuff they did in Weimar. Gen Z barely leaves their houses. The only exception, from what I've heard, is state school college frat parties, which I've heard are still crazy. That being said, a great irony is that what's flipped is we've moved from a system where the outsider youth are degenerates or leftists to one where the elite are said degenerate leftists and the youth counterculture is conservative. A real bizarre trading of places. Our era will probably be remembered as a creative period for conservative culture comparable to what the Weimar was for the left. We're already seeing this in that the new slang today is all from 4chan. The new interesting comedians, YouTubers, podcasters, thinkers, and popular artists are all at least conservative coded, with examples including Joe Rogan, Jordan Peterson, Russell Brand, Shane Gillis, or even someone like a Mr. Beast is a middle America bro. History is a twisted mirror, and every era of history is a reflection of certain historic events from both the far future and the far past. Our era of history, at different points, for example, reflects the fall of the Roman Republic, the Weimar period, the French Revolution, or the 17th century. That being said, the Weimar has glimmers of much later periods of history. It foreshadows the degeneracy of later eras of history in an interesting way. We tend to view the people from the first half of the 20th century as prim, proper, hardworking, disciplined, and all that stuff. When young people think of the kinds of people who lived in the 50s or who fought in the world wars, that's the image we get in our minds. That being said, I think that stereotype has more to do with the incentive structures of that kind of society, which actually rewarded hard work and discipline. The reason I say this is that the Weimar is an example of removing those incentives to see what happens. I think part of the reason that we parallel the Weimar period is that we're a society in which social mobility has died for complex reasons, thus removing the incentive to not be a degenerate. This is the era of the lowest social mobility in American history ever, which also is played into by the incredibly high inequality rates. The real drama of this time period is to think that the Kaiser's Germany, World War I, and the Weimar period, followed by the Nazis and the Cold War colonization of Germany, all happens to the exact same people. If you were 18 years old in World War I, you would be 50 years old when the Cold War started. You might even be able to live to the 21st century if you held on for a really long time. Imagine the insane trauma that one life would have. We like to split history into different discrete eras, but to the people involved, this was all one lifetime. What happened with the Weimar period to make it appear like our era of history is that due to the Great Depression and World War II, the seeds planted in Weimar lay pregnant for decades. Then in the 1960s, a lot of them started to flower again. The 1920s are the parents to the 1960s. As the 60s established the cultural code which we have until today, as the logic of the system started to work through, you ended up with a culture like that from which it originated it, that being the Weimar period. The irony is that most people hated the Weimar Republic except for one demographic, that being the leftist intellectuals and artists who, for them, it was a golden age. This exact group of people were the same who designed the new postmodern social compromise, and thus they tried to engineer an ideal society to be as much like the Weimar period as possible. This all begs the same question. We all know what happened at the end of the Weimar. We know that the degradation of the Weimar Republic disgusted the average German so much that they elected a certain Austrian painter who then took Germany into a hard right direction. Will that happen to us? Part 3. The Austrian painter. I want to hammer home the point that it's the exact same people who are living through each of these phases in German history. This is one of the craziest things about the 20th century, and it's most evident in places like China or Russia, Russia, but even in Britain or America, the cultural changes of that century are so massive that it almost breaks your brain. Boys who fought in the American Civil War lived to see the atom bomb. I think having that much change that fast kind of broke our society's brain, but that's another point. I also don't think we have the tools to deal with the trauma of the world wars and industrialization, and thus we have psychological neuroses from that which manifest even today. That being said, and this isn't a video at the psychology of why Germans elected Hitler, although I am going to make that video soon, the Weimar period clearly established a situation in which Germans wanted the Nazis. It's fairly obvious that the social order of Weimar had far more losers than winners. This is one of the general facts about degeneracy, in which a small group of people have a lot of fun, and a large part of the population are vastly less happy with the breakdown of traditional social roles. One of the interesting things I've read from Amaury de Riencourt is that the most fervent supporters of the Nazi Party were young women. To be fair, the most fervent supporters of any dominant ideology will be young women, which is something George Orwell has written about. That being said, I think there is some sort of emotional story which happened to a lot of German young women. After being prostitutes during the Weimar period, they hyper-reacted when they grew older, overcompensating with the family and order-obsessed Nazis. Keep in mind, the economic and social losers from Nazi Germany were the countryside, and most Germans were ethnically rural, in that urbanization was a very recent process, and thus most Germans were still socially conservative. More Germans than not viewed the Weimar period with complete disgust, while small isolated urban bubbles, which were still pretty small percentages of the city themselves, liked this age. What the Nazis were was an attempt to try World War I again. The irony is I think most Germans preferred the de facto social structure of Germany during World War I to the de jure legal condition. Germany was on paper a decentralized aristocratic monarchy with a parliament, total male suffrage, and a capitalist economic system. The actual reality was that Germany was a nationalistic military dictatorship in de facto union with Austria, in which all young men were in the military under a socialist command economy. For complex reasons I explain in this text wall, Germans believed that they nearly won World War I, and that they only lost since they were stabbed in the back. This was projected onto hatred of the Jews, who are an easy scapegoat across history. This was justifiable to the German people since Jews were disproportionate in communist organizations, the Weimar government, among degenerate artists, and were on average significantly wealthier. That being said, the Jews were less than 1% of Germany's population, weren't in that many positions of serious authority, they didn't stab Germany in the back resulting in the loss of World War I, and most German Jews were very patriotic and served Germany faithfully. Germany's Jews were highly assimilated into German culture. Hitler gave the Germans the second shot they thought they deserved with World War I. The Germans fought heroically, but they still lost. We all know the story. The Germans destroyed their honor as a nation and are still trying to recover their national identity from the horrors of the atrocities they committed. With all of this, we see the Germans trying to wash out the shame of Weimar by going as far as possible in the other direction. The story of Weimar and the following Nazis is fundamentally the story of the lack of wisdom and the rationalizing of emotions. What religion at its best does is to teach us the cognitive biases implicit in our own minds so that we can gain self-awareness and are thus capable of not sliding into the natural flaws of our characters. The Germans were not self-aware. They first rationalized degeneracy and then in reaction to it rationalized genocide. They've continued the pattern and have since rationalized suicidal, nihilistic self-loathing as a further reaction. They need to break out of this cycle and take a deep breath if they want their nation to survive. That being said, as I've said a million times, we are not a wise society. We have already repeated the degeneracy of Weimar, but will we repeat the Austrian painter? If you folks watch my videos, you'll see that I have frequently said that the West is on the verge of a far-right backlash. There's frankly no way that we don't have it, given how much the left has pushed its agenda to such ludicrous logical extensions that the average person lives in poverty, mass immigration is changing demographics, the normal person is discriminated against in every possible way, and constantly humiliated by the culture for nothing they've done wrong. It's almost like the left is begging the right to create another Hitler. Much like the Weimar leftists, the modern left is completely degenerate, nihilistic, and short-sighted. They have no idea what they're doing, what demon they're creating. If you told them the logic, they'd just stare blankly at you and continue to be degenerates without a thought. That being said, the chaos that comes from this is further propelling a population to want the same things that the Nazis came out of. I think most people in the West today want a clean, family-oriented, nationalistic government. More and more white people want an explicitly ethno-nationalist government which pushes their ethnic self-interests. Eugenics is becoming more popular, partly due to the opportunities with genetic engineering. The irony is that none of this was true 10 years ago, but the Weimar-descended left is so obnoxious that in an effort to keep people from becoming Nazis, they ended up making them anyway. With all this said and done, the future is still the future. We have the ability to gain self-awareness so that this backlash doesn't just keep this negative cycle going. Going from one extreme to another helps no one.